Welcome back. What I would like to try to do tonight, and again, I'm not going to rush, but there's a great deal of meaty stuff for us to discuss tonight. I would need to wrap up what we didn't finish last week, and I'm going to do it just in a summary kind of way so that we have a better understanding or a full understanding of what covenant ethics are. And then tonight's class is really where we finally get into sort of grappling with these things. The first two courses, one on creation ethics, one on covenant ethics, really needed to set the scene or set what those terms mean, define them. Tonight, we're going to talk about the tension between them. And this is where our own ethical compass is going to come into play, guided by Jewish tradition, but really how we deal with the tension between these two, the particular and the universal, or the proximate and the urgent. So we're going to look at that in just a moment. But let me just sort of wrap up last week so we have a full understanding of covenant ethics. And I'm skipping the last two texts that we didn't cover, but I'll just share this with you quickly. So, so this was the end of the class that we didn't get to last week. So just that we understand what covenant ethics are and how they differ from creation ethics. Creation ethics were very universal, right? It was our responsibility to care for everyone because they were created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that care went beyond the bare minimum of not.
People just heard you, Mel.
Hang on a second. If you can just mute your microphone if you're not lecturing and doing the course. That care went beyond just not killing people, but actually into a broader concern for their well-being. And we talked about the bare minimum and then the striving or the higher. That was creation ethics, based on this idea, again, of being created in God's image. Covenant ethics were more particularistic, more particular than universalistic. And they were, according to David Hartman, they mean that the prioritization of care, remember we did those circles of concern, those concentric circles of concern, that the prioritization of care to those who are closest to us takes precedent. And the closer the relationship, the closer the attention required. You can agree or disagree with this, but that is what this frame is. And that Jewish ethics that include helping those around us go beyond the very basic needs of food and water and shelter, but into offering social and emotional supports and help as well. So that our care and responsibility for others is not, it doesn't have a floor. Well, I guess it has a floor, but it doesn't have a ceiling. And we should be concerned about how one receives, let's say, the tzedakah or the charity that we're giving them. In what way do they receive it so that they feel valued and validated by the act? So it's the how as well as the what. So that was covenant ethics and creation ethics, for that matter, in the contrast between the two. Any questions about those two? Okay. So now let me bring up this. Okay, so again, I'm going to share this bit of my screen. Please remind me to turn off my screen share from time to time in case I forget. So now we're going to talk about the tension between these two things. And let's start here with these two sort of framing questions, which I'd like us to discuss. And remember, last time I think it worked well that we put our questions in the chat if you had them. Raise your hand if you'd like to have a comment using the raise your hand function. And if we can just, being aware that we have lots of people in our course, try to keep our comments, one, on topic, and two, relatively succinct so that others can share. So what are the situations where you see one set, creation or covenant, right, universal or particular, applying instead of another? Where do universal ethics apply in your worldview? Where do more particular ethics apply? And where do these collide? Where is there tension between them? And where, based on your own sort of rules of the road, where do you prioritize one over the other? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? When is your concern about those that are in your family? What are the criteria to place family first? Jonathan.
Well, in the news, there's been lots of, we've been hearing a lot about the landslides and the people that are affected, like in Merritt, for example. And certainly those folks that are being impacted directly, I think, need some help. I think creation ethics kind of applies there, us offering some help to them from here. And when I think of kind of really helping up close to me or prioritizing, I think of, I don't have anybody that's been stuck in a landslide or, with lots of rain, but, COVID-19 is kind of a great example of bringing the family in close and making sure that everybody, is safe and vaccinated. And, we've prioritized our family, certainly for COVID.
So let's imagine then, that's a really good example, Jonathan. Let's imagine then a scenario where, and we are aware of those in Merritt and Hope and beyond that are, in dire straits. They've had to evacuate their homes. They are without shelter. They're without their clothes and, those kinds of things. And whatever the immediate need, or I should say, whatever the close need is for somebody in your family or your extended circle, right here in Vancouver. Could be that they too are, that their home was impacted by the rainstorm and they're, I don't know, they've lost power, or their car was, a tree fell on my car the other day. It's okay. Broke the window. It can still drive. Needed to replace that front window anyways. So how would you decide between helping those in Merritt and Hope and helping those in your neighborhood or in your circle of friends? Is it the degree of need? Is it the proximity?
I think for me, some things just off the top of my head, I think about are, how much time do I have to give to this? Because I have other responsibilities. I work and have a family. We have a lot of things going on. So how much time do I have to give? How much extra money maybe do we have that we can share or give? So those are a couple of things that kind of pop into my mind, like right away. But I'm certainly open to hear other things that come into people's mind.
Does anybody else have a system or methodology? Yeah, Marcus.
Hi. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed the first 2 weeks, but I'm hearing this one. These things are pretty situational, aren't they? Actions have consequences. Nobody knows precisely what those consequences are. On the one hand, in Merritt, you're not probably going to know what the consequences are of looking out for people you don't know. Your family, you're probably going to have some idea what the consequences of that might be. And I think those are what the kind of determining factors that people play by. There's a couple of books right now about planes. They've been taken hostage. The plane's going to go down, or your family. Choose the plane, and obviously the consequences of that are vast, or your family. These are still situational things, aren't they? Yeah. And, what are you going to do? For me, the plane's not going to crash. My family's going to go. The consequences are too vast otherwise. Right. So for the family, you never know the consequences, except for yourself and your own conscience.
One of the texts we're going to look at tonight, because we're going to give us some tools to try to navigate this tension. But one of the texts we're going to look at tonight talks about how the disparity in between how many people you know, right? The more people that know you, the more likely it is that you are to get support in a time of crisis. So does that preference more social people? Does that preference people that live in bigger cities? Does that preference people that have bigger families? And is that the right gauge for how deserving of help somebody should be? Just one of the questions that comes up. So let's dive into this a little bit, and again, using some tools from our tradition. So over the last two classes, we've looked at first at creation ethics and then at covenant ethics. And we're now going to examine the relationship between those two categories. They can often coexist seamlessly. And we've talked about ways that you can divide yourself, right? So that if there's not limited resources, you can help everybody. And if there are limited resources, then you can apportion those in a way that you think is equitable. But what about when there are tensions, such as limited resources, when you only have so much time, or you only have so much money, or you can only get to one and not to the other? What do you do and how do you navigate that? So do you help those that are most in need, urgency, or those that are closest to you, proximity? And here I mean closest of relationship, as well as perhaps just, geographically close to you. So the first text that's going to grapple with this is a bit of a longer one than I would normally share, and I don't know if you had a chance to read it in advance, but it's this lecture that's given by Karen Green, and she's in dialogue in her lecture with Peter Singer. Both are modern philosophers, and they're trying to articulate this tension between universalistic and particularistic ethical systems. If you're not familiar with Karen Green, and I wasn't, I knew of Peter Singer, but not Karen Green. She's a professor of philosophy in Australia, University of Melbourne, and her sort of body of work has a lot to do with women's intellectual history. But it was in this lecture that we're going to share a portion of in a moment that she really articulates this tension. And then Peter Singer, you may be more familiar with him. His work in applied ethics and his activism in politics have informed this utilitarian, and somebody referenced that in the chat, approach. And he is certainly of the school that one deals with urgency as opposed to proximity. But we're going to look at that in a second. So here's the passage from this lecture, this major debate between these two ethicists about whether people should bear greater ethical responsibility for those closest to them or for those who are in the greatest need. And the major debate partners here are Green and Singer. So this is Green speaking, and I'm sorry to read it to you, but I don't know how else to do this text. If we were in, I would say take 5 minutes and read the text, but I think this is a better way to go. You'll tell me if I'm wrong. So Peter Singer has developed a powerful argument that apparently shows that most of us are far more immoral than we take ourselves to be. Many people follow a minimalistic morality. They avoid killing, avoid stealing, lying, and cruelty, but feel no obligation to devote themselves to the well-being of everybody else. We commend those who give generously to foreign aid, but we do not look on those who fail to give as unthinking criminals or moral reprobates. According to Singer, our standard judgments are seriously askew. Those who fail to do what they can to alleviate the absolute poverty of the worst off in the world are not quite as bad as murderers and thieves, for they do not intentionally act in such a way as to kill and deprive others. They are, however, as bad as reckless drivers who act in a way which will cause death and destruction without desiring these predictable consequences. If such a theory has consequences which conflict with our intuitions, it is possible that we need to revise our intuitions and the behavior that follows. But it is also possible that our intuitions give us reason to revise our principles. Rather than being faced with one drowning child, easily saved by individual action, our situation is comparable to that of a strong swimmer on the beach at Bondi. Remember, she's in Australia. After a freak wave has washed away the sandbank. And many people are drowning, and at least a goodly number have a prima facie obligation to help them. But which one is any particularly strong swimmer to save? In a situation like this, a pragmatic principle solves the decision problem. Each drowning person has an equal right to be saved. Efficacy dictates that one saves the closest. If one person is equally close to two potential rescuers, then they should coordinate their activities, one agreeing to save the closest, the other the next closest. And lifeguards should then divide their responsibilities for saving people on the beach, thus turning a diffuse and unfillable duty into a particular and achievable one. Without a pragmatic tiebreaker which divides their responsibilities, their collective aim of saving as many of the drowning people as possible would not be achieved. Last part here. By analogy, we will not solve the problem of international poverty and starvation by putting individuals in a situation in which they feel guilty if they merely pay their taxes and care for their own families. We need rather to formulate principles of organization that will enable each country to fulfill its obligations towards its own people. A fair way of dividing the responsibility for children was to make parents responsible for their own children. In a similar fashion, an impartialist perspective could come up with no better scheme for dividing responsibility among nations than to make each nation responsible for the care of its own people. So this has the same sort of advantages as dividing responsibility for children. Each nation has its own history, customs, and priorities. No matter how strange and ungrounded these may seem to outsiders, they will be the sorts of things nations will need to develop in their own way. Just as a family that is sufficiently well run offers, besides basic care, a history, set of habits, and sense of one's place in the community, so a state that is sufficiently well run offers a set of traditions, a history, and a sense of one's place in the international community. Each nation has a prima facie obligation to care for its own people, and in a well-ordered system of divided responsibility, it will then have no further obligations. So, any questions about this, where Green's perspective is? Anybody want to summarize her view from that excerpt from her lecture? What is she saying in terms of this tension between urgency and proximity, or creation versus covenant? What is her justification for caring in a covenant kind of way, not a creation way, not a universalistic, but a particularistic way? What is her justification for that? What's her argument? Nobody? Okay. So she's saying that if everybody just takes care of their own, then in a very equitable kind of way, then everyone will be taken care of. If America takes care of Americans and Canadians take care of Canadians, then that's how it should work. Just like those people on the beach, you get the one closest to you and I'll get the one closest to me. I think there's a lot of assumptions in that. I think that there's a lot of best intentions, idealism, if you would. Doesn't quite work that way. But the other side of it then is the question of, so where does your responsibility for those closest to you end, and your responsibility for those in urgency but far away begin? Whether it's hope or merit, or as a case that I'm dealing with right now, I've come to know this Jewish community in Uganda that is in desperate need. They, if you've seen my Facebook post, they have no food. They have no food. They had to eat their seeds. And their needs are fairly modest. I mean, a few $1,000s could feed this community for weeks, if not months. And at the same time, we have needs here in our community. How responsible is it for me to take, discretionary fund money, tzedakah money that you've given me to distribute, and send it outside of our community to this Ugandan community? Like, is that the right thing to do? Maybe that $1,000 could do more good for them, save more lives there than it could here, but I don't know those people. So, I mean, this is the tension that I'm dealing with right now. We're working through it. So just to give a quick summary then, before we drive into a question that hopefully you'll actually talk about. So Green argues for a system in which people are more responsible for some people than for others. And she suggests that only such a system can ultimately ensure that everyone will be taken care of. Again, I think that there's an idealism in there, but that's her understanding. She is arguing against those, such as Singer, who suggest that people should determine how responsible they are for others based not on whether they live near one another, whether they are family or the like, but based on who has a greater need, that urgency takes precedent. Green argues that a system of divided responsibility where certain people are responsible for certain other specific people aligns more closely with our ethical intuitions and will result in more people getting cared for. Singer, on the other hand, believes that we ought to distribute resources entirely based on urgency of need, first making sure no human dies for lack of resources, and then distributing resources for any other need. So here's the question. What are the costs and benefits of a divided or universal ethical system? What are the cost benefits of Green's divided system, Singer's universal ethical system? And how have these philosophies of giving manifest themselves in your own life? So maybe it's too hard to think about this in the broad scope. So take it personal. Take it to the example that I'm dealing with Uganda. Find one in your own life. Do you prioritize those close to you or those in the greatest need? And what about those close and those far away? Feel free to answer any of that. Mark, and you need to unmute.
I think vaccination would be a good example. We're on the third shot now, and we have countries in Africa, especially in many other places, who haven't even had the first one. But
So what do you think we should do?
here we are. We got to look after our own people. So we're on the third shot, but we're not really dealing with fairness here. Because if we were fair, we would divide our big inventory of vaccine and give it to others who haven't had one yet.
So Green would say that we are being fair. Green would say that prioritizing the needs of your citizens takes precedent.
Okay.
Surely.
So we are dealing according to Green then.
Yeah, but she's only one opinion, and we haven't even gotten to the Talmud yet. Shirley.
Well, so I think greens is easier for us to live with because it's easy enough for us to other people. You know, we could all other these people in Africa, which we do most of the time, and we won't lose sleep over it. But if we other somebody we see every day, we're going to lose sleep over it.
So how would you make that decision then?
I'm not the ethicist. I can't. I probably just do what I probably try to do a balance, which obviously leaning more toward the proximate that is more useful, you know, and that I can see the results.
If we get to it, we'll look at a rabbinic text that will take that approach. Barbara.
I mean, here we're talking about crises that are immediate. And I often think that we forget about the long term and if we do good just for today, what happens to our grandchildren? That's the one I struggle with. How do we do climate change when you feel so totally helpless in front of bureaucracy and politicians? So you turn to something that's close at hand that you can actually see you've made a difference. Because you can't grapple with the enormity of the situation we're facing. It's like that little girl throwing starfish back into the ocean.
Right. You saved that one. You made a difference for that one. Yeah.
Right.
Well done, poem.
I
Paula.
think the problem with Green's approach is that it implies that people in more developed countries don't have a role that they've played in the poorer countries. And so it's as if we were completely independent, and we're not. So it to me, it seems very simplistic to say everyone look out for themselves when we have policies and that have clearly made other countries more vulnerable or prevented them from meeting their own needs, actually.
Charles.
I've been reading about Singer since I was in university 30, 40 years ago, and he's always challenging, but I think this idea, the way I take it is almost, he's suggesting we don't have to degrade ourselves down to the lowest common denominator. We have to address every single woe in the world, then we just need to give everything away until we raise it up a little bit. And that's troubling. That can't possibly be right. But that's, I think, where Singer is leading us to.
Right. So we're going to look at a rabbinic text on that also. This is all great. You're going right down the path that the Hartman course wants us to go. So let's now look at a rabbinic text that's going to try to, it's really just going to place the same tension, but in a more Jewish or rabbinic context. So this is a text from the Tosefta, Baba Metzia. So Tosefta is if you think of a page of Talmud, you've got that middle column. I think we've talked about this before. And you got all this stuff written around the outside. Tosefta is one of those things around the outside. Tosefta means extra, and it's an additional lens. Some call it a baraita. Another teaching doesn't come from the core rabbis, but is not too far removed from the primary text. So this particular text, Tosefta de Baba Metzia, appears to be a rabbinic ethical thought experiment. So we're not saying this really happened. The rabbis do a lot of this. They do a lot of hypothetical thinking for things that never took place, and we make a mistake when we think, oh, that really happened. And it tries to connect, I think, the argument between Green and Singer in the previous source. So here's the text. In the case of a cistern or a water container, which belongs to the people of a town, if there is enough water for only the townspeople or others, thinking non-townspeople, the townspeople have precedence in drinking the water over the others. You give water to those in your town versus those outside of your town first. I think about this a lot when I grew up in California where they had no water, and we got it all from San Francisco. Others, or the townspeople's animals, the lives of others have precedent over those of your animals. Now we're getting into a hierarchy now of animals versus human beings. Rabbi Yossi says that the townspeople's animals have precedent before the lives of others. So Rabbi Yossi is taking the different opinion. He's very much of the Green camp. Before the lives of others, the animals of the townspeople or the animals of others, the animals of the townspeople have precedent to the animals of others. Drinking water for the others or the laundry of the townspeople, the lives of others have precedent over their laundry. Rabbi Yossi, it's good if he's on your side, I guess. Rabbi Yossi says that laundry of the townspeople comes before the lives of others. The laundry of the townspeople or the laundry of others, the laundry of the townspeople comes first. Pretty straightforward hierarchy here, to which Rabbi Yossi throws a bit of a wrench into it. So a similar kind of attempt as Green and Singer do to place some kind of rules of the road to how you navigate this tension. We can agree or disagree with Rabbi Yossi or the rabbis in this, but we can see that we have a Green school of thought and a Singer school of thought that also exists within the Talmud. So Green and Singer are not just out of nothing. Their same views can be rooted in the Talmud. Okay, I can skip that. So now let's get into it. So we're going to look at a text from, I don't think this is from Deuteronomy. Hang on, let me double check. I might have missed that. Sorry, this is not from Deuteronomy. I have that wrong. It's actually from a Tanya. So that's left over from before. This is not right. Yeah, sorry. That forget that slide that you saw. That was from before. So trying to resolve this conflict, I want to share two texts with you. This is text 3 and text 4. And we're going to consider how in times of limited resources, some Jewish voices lean towards system of divided responsibility to guide our ethical responses. So this would be the Green school, if you would. And in text 3, this passage presents a tension between two Jewish values of supporting one's parents and giving charity to the hungry. And it guides us to resolve these tensions by prioritizing our giving first to parents, then to siblings, then other relatives, then neighbors, then non-neighbors. So again, a pretty traditional hierarchy if we go back to our circles of concern. The second text, we're going to read these in sequence. The second text is a modern legal authority, and it's troubled by texts such as the one above, where you have that traditional hierarchy, which would mean that a person might spend all of their available resources supporting only the poor in their immediate family. And the author here is concerned that poor people who do not have relatives with means will have no possible way to get support. If you only care for those within your family, you don't have a large family, or your family is not wealthy, you're never going to get support because everybody's taking care of their own. So here's the first text, the one where you support your circles of family. If someone has food in their home and wishes also to give charity and support others from his resources, then how should they do so?
For sure that
First, one supports one's parents.
Against two.
Sorry?
Against two, the Mexican?
Can you mute your microphone, whoever's speaking?
knock the guy down going in to try and shoot.
Okay, I got it. First, one supports one's parents. And if there is surplus, then your siblings. If there is surplus, then your extended family. If there is surplus, then your neighborhood. If there is surplus, then you support those in your city. If there is surplus, then you support the rest of the Jewish people. So that's the particularistic view. And here's the second text. Now, this is not Shulchan Aruch, but a later
Watch
text.
this.
Sorry,
Going in to shoot me troops.
This is not Shulchan Aruch, but a commentary on Shulchan Aruch that came out later. The Shulchan Aruch was a boiling down of Jewish teaching to the point that you could give this book to your child as they went off to yeshiva or university. Here's the rules of the road for being a Jew in the world. And so this is yet a commentary on sort of a Cole's Notes version of the Talmud. It's a commentary on the Cole's Notes. Now there is something fundamental about the details of the law above that troubles me deeply. So this writer is commenting on that earlier text I just read to you. For if we explain the text that I have cited according to their simple meaning, that certain groups are prior to others, they imply that one may distribute the entirety of one's tzedakah money to one group within that established hierarchy, and need not give it all to those who fall outside of that specific group. But it is well known that every wealthy person has many more relatives who are poor, and how much more that is true for people whose charity funds are scant. And if this is the case, poor people without wealthy relatives will die of starvation. Now, how is it possible to say this? Therefore, in my humble opinion, the explanation of charity priorities is as follows. Certainly, every person, whether of modest or significant means, is obligated to give a portion of their charity money to needy people who are not relatives. But to their poor relatives, they should give a greater amount than is given to those who are not related, and so on along the ladder of priorities. So just to summarize these two ideas, in the first text, even within the category of immediate family, there might not be enough resources for everyone. Thus, one should prioritize certain people absolutely based on our relationship with them. You take care of your parents and your kids before your aunts and uncles and cousins. And this is Green's view, though it comes from Talmud. The second text, the source 4, suggests that rather than prioritizing one's close relationships absolutely, one should allot a percentage of resources to those who are not in your inner circle. Let's say you've got 100%, 75% go to family, but 25% doesn't go to family. That goes to everybody else outside of your circles. His idea of prioritization means giving a higher percentage to those closer relationships, but still giving to those with whom you have less or perhaps no relationship. This would be the argument that I need to support Uganda and Jews in the Vancouver Jewish community. Systems of divided responsibility are in trouble when there are some groups with no one who has any resources responsible for them. Think about it. If everybody takes care of their own and you are, again, without family, nobody takes care of you. Although we owe more to those closest to us, we must give at least something to people who are far from us but in need. And so here's our questions. Do you experience this tension between the needs of your parents and those of your children? And does this resolution, source 3, those food to circles of concern, seem morally correct to you? Let's just stop there for a second. We'll get to the other questions in a moment. How do you deal with the tension between caring for your parents and caring for your children? You've got limited resources. Who gets what?
Got none.
Anybody?
Can't answer.
Jonathan.
So I'm fortunate that we have parents that, are still young enough that are able to care for themselves. And they actually help us a bit with the children. So we're not faced with, are we going to help mom and dad, or are we going to help the kids? We're able to prioritize the kids really at this point. But maybe in 10 years, that's going to change a bit.
Anybody else have a similar scenario? I mean, looking around the Zoom screen, I could change the scenario a little bit, recognizing that for some of you, you are the parents and caring for your children and grandchildren.
I'll say something maybe, could I?
Yeah, go ahead, Marcus.
I mean, as someone that has neither children or parents, I should know. No, I mean, obviously it's a pretty situational thing, isn't it? Which comes first, the children or the parents? But without the parents, you wouldn't have children. It's as simple as that.
Mm.
And your conscience, of course. Can you have children again?
Mm. Tony.
I don't get it. what you're saying.
Like I go back to when my daughter was younger, it was me, but I was also the caregiver, having responsibility for my parents. And I never felt, this isn't exactly, in most cases, there was always a way that I didn't have to choose one or the other, but that you could work to make them both work. And, it wasn't like a financial obligation, but a time obligation. And, you can put things together to make them work. You don't always have to divide everything into a little parcel and say, well, this is your 15 minutes or this is whatever. So I think you look at compromising situations and you take that and carry it further into other situations. It's not so much of one or the other. It's how do you incorporate many?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that gets into the fourth text, right? The fourth text, the last one that I shared, which is the formula where, again, maybe it's 75% to family, but you're not allowed to give it all to family. You have to leave some for the universal, 25% or whatever it is. So first of all, do you think that that's a better system? If you had to pick between these two, which is the better system? The first text or the second text? Mike.
I think the second text is the better, where you take care of yourself but leave sufficient to help for the universal as well. I think going back to Green's initial premise that every community looks after itself, it doesn't take into account that countries are not all equal. And so to say that Canada will look after itself, and the case you mentioned, Uganda can look after its own, it's not possible. I mean, there's so much inequality in the world that if all the developed countries could spread some of their wealth, I think it would assist the underdeveloped countries or the developing countries.
But are you prepared then? And Hartman references this in the podcast that we listened to, where he talked about Hanukkah presents or birthday presents, or whatever it was, and how his children have claim, right? They have claim on him. And so it is expected that he will, shower them with gifts at their birthdays or at Hanukkah. But up to what point, right? It's one thing to say, I'm not going to get you your 6th or 7th present because I need to send that money to those starving in Africa. It's another thing to say that though you want to go to summer camp, I've reached the limit of what I can support with you, because that 25% that could send you to summer camp, I have decided that money needs to go to those starving in Africa. So in a practical way, are we prepared to deny those closest to us for this altruistic value of universalism? Altruistic is probably labeling it. I won't call it that. For this universal value.
Well, if I think about the way I was brought up, we were brought up that way, that sometimes we would have to forego certain things to be able to help other people. I grew up in a very small town, and my father had a store, and there was a lot of need, and there were times when we went without stuff to be able to help the people in the community. It was the way we were brought up.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there is, I think, an important lesson that we teach when we model that. I feel this way with our children. I mean, Hanukkah's coming up, so my wife didn't grow up with gifts on Hanukkah, and my family, we did. The bit of a compromise that we've reached is that they get a gift for every night, but they only get 1 or 2 from us because they have grandparents and they have cousins and stuff like that, or that give them gifts. But one night we don't do any gifts, even though there's enough to go around that we could cover all 8 nights. On one night, our gift is to go and to do some act of tzedakah. Lately, it's been the downtown east side, making meals and delivering them by hand and stuff like that, to recognize that there's we have to model that it's not all about us, right? That we have to care for the universal as well. Sharon. You're on mute, Sharon. Sharon, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. I forgot that I put my hand up. I think I like that idea that you give something to the greater good, whatever amount it is, but then you keep some for those closest to you. But those close to you, I mean, there's different needs and it's going to depend, so when you talk about what's more important, parents or kids, I mean, there's different needs and you have to always balance what those needs are in every case.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be, one might require a lot of money, one might require not that much money, but some time, you know what I mean? There's different, you have to balance it out.
So I'll give you one of the dilemmas that I'm facing right now. So we have a child in the congregation that wants to go to a youth group event, a youth group program, a convention next year in February. And it's about $1,000. It's 2 kids in one family. I don't want to give too much away, but they're siblings and they have only one parent. The other parent had died. So there are limited resources for that family and they want to go to this program. And thank God we have enough money in my discretionary fund that I could make that possible. And now I've learned about this Ugandan community that same $1,000 could feed hundreds of people for a month. What do I do? Who gets the $1,000? Barbara. By the way, the rabbi's solution to this is go raise another $1,000, but that's not.
Yes. There's something to be said, this whole idea of paying it forward. I don't think it's either or. And like Tony says, resources, there is the theory that since we are all interconnected, if we help those people in Uganda, who knows, the next Einstein might be in that congregation. So we're helping the whole world.
Mm.
And then if we are helping the whole world, we're helping our family as well. So I think that striking a balance, I don't know, 75, 25, 80, 20, whatever, is really important because we don't live in isolation. And if we become an inbred little community of Jews in the middle of a world in need, that's not right either.
Mm-hmm. Shirley, and then we're going to move on to another challenge to this tension.
So I don't want to solve this problem very easily for you, but are you in touch with the rabbi who roves around Africa? Because there is one.
No, I'm not in touch with that rabbi, but there is actually a woman in our community, who's Ruth Hoffman, who does work in Uganda. And so she and I are talking about this particular community.
Okay, because there's another woman, and I can tell you later, who's written a book about it and has contacts as well. So I'll give that to you.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on to another challenge. So we haven't necessarily resolved that, but maybe we're getting closer in our own minds as to how we would apply these different values. So then we raise the question of, okay, let's go to the full universal that we give to whomever needs for as much as we can. There's a fantastic Talmudic text that takes this to the extreme and questions whether we can go there. So Eleazar, the man of Berta, that's where he was from, whenever the communal fundraisers would see him, whenever Federation would see him, right, they would run and they would hide. The fundraisers would run and hide. The Federation solicitors would run and hide. For whatever he had with him, he would give them. One day he went to the market to buy the items for his own daughter's dowry. The charity collectors saw him and they hid from him, but he ran after them and said to them, "I swear you must tell me, with what cause are you busy?" And they answered, because they can't lie, "With the marriage dowry of an orphan boy marrying an orphan girl." And he said to them, "I swear by the temple worship," right? I put my hand on the Bible, "that those needy brides take precedent over my own daughter." And so he took everything he had with him and gave it to them. Everything he was going to use to buy his own daughter's dowry, and he gave it to them. Only one coin remained in his possession, and with it he bought some grain of wheat. And when he came home, he climbed up and he threw them into the storage room. And his wife came home and asked her daughter, "What did your father bring you?" And the daughter replied, "Whatever he brought, he threw in the storage room." She went to the open door of the storage room and found that it was so full of wheat that the wheat was pouring out of the door's hinges, and that the volume of the wheat made it impossible to open the door. She, the daughter, went to the study hall and said, "Come and see what your beloved, your friend, did for you." He replied to her, "As far as you're concerned, I swear by the temple worship that it is all dedicated to sacred use, and you have no more priority claim of it or on it than any of the poor of Israel." That last part may be a little confusing. To unpack it just a little bit, he's not even saying that this grain is for her, but he's saying that because of this miracle that happened with this little bit of grain that he threw into the storehouse, and that it blossomed to fill the coffers of his barn, that's not all for her. She can't take it all. There's far more than she would need, that all of the hungry and all the poor of Israel need to partake of that also. So he's further dividing what he has, or giving away all that he has. So it's about a parent who evaluates his ethical responsibility entirely based on need and does not think of relationship as relevant at all. A pre-modern Peter Singer, if you would. Elazar stands out as someone who views urgency of need as the key variable in determining ethical responsibility. Like Singer, he believes that urgency overrides his responsibility to his own close family relationships. Hold on to that and ask yourself, do you agree with that? When push comes to shove, does urgency override responsibility to your own close relationships? Elazar devalues relationship as a factor in his ethical responsibility to the extent that he takes from what God has miraculously given to him for his children to support the poor. It is not clear what the others think of Elazar. On the one hand, they portray him as favored by God, but on the other, those who collect charity run from him as though they do not want him to give away his family goods. They're trying to save him from himself. So what do you think of Elazar's actions as a parent? Is this the right thing to do? Would you have made the same choices? And what do the authors of this text think about him? What are the ethical implications of this? The first question is probably more interesting than the second. Would you do it this way? Does need take precedent over relationship? That's a straightforward question. Yes or no?
Well,
Una.
well, there's the question of responsibility here. You have a greater responsibility as a parent than you do as just a general citizen.
Why?
So, why do you have a greater responsibility?
Yeah, why?
Because those closest to you, well, not necessarily those closest to you, but your helpless children are the people that you have a direct need, to use that word, you have a direct need to provide from them. Other things are indirect, which doesn't make them meaningless, but they are indirect.
But you're still using relationship. He's throwing out relationship. He's saying if there's need, then you take care of need. Nothing to do with.
I'm using the idea of responsibility.
Right.
Because.
But why are you more responsible for your children than others in need?
Why are you more responsible to your children?
Yeah.
Well, because that is the absolute essential connection between a parent and a child. You are responsible for that care. You are directly and firstly and primarily responsible for that care. So it seems that you have responsibility in those ever widening circles, but your first primary responsibility is to your child.
Alina.
My answer to your question is simply no. And in a way, these are silly questions. They're very absolutist. I guess that they're all theoretical. In that situation, I would, if I were the father walking through the market and I was about to buy my daughter who was about to get married, 10 dresses, let's say, maybe I'd get her 8 and give 2 to this needy bride. And I think that intuitively, without really assigning a percentage, that's what that's what I do. And I imagine that's what most of us do, that there's a certain assignment of money and of time and of whatever other resources that I have that do go out in concentric circles. It just sort of does naturally happen, so that I certainly give much more to my children than I do when I'm signing some kind of a plea for Women's Rape Center or you know, the people in Uganda. There's just some kind of a natural progression that happens.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I think that the default position for many of us is the green position, right? Which is that, well, green with a little bit of singer, right? The default position is to try to find a compromise between these two, which goes back to that earlier text of you have to set aside something for those that are not going to be cared for, but you can prioritize family first. I think that's our default position. How we decide what that priority is, I mean, that's really where it all comes down to. Remember, I said finding a balance is not an acceptable answer in this class, right? That you're going to balance them. We have to discover what the balance is. When you get to that formula, now we've come up with an ethic. But just to say I'm going to find a balance, I think that's too ambiguous. Jack, you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking that in that example, this would be a teaching moment to talk to your kids and say, I have this dilemma. I see the need there. I see my obligation and desire for you. Would you be satisfied with a lesser amount so I can also satisfy the others?
Right.
Same with Hanukkah presents. I mean, in North America, we have so much. And to say, let's donate to others, it becomes something to teach our kids that we need to share.
Mm. Right, and we hope that they give the right answer, right? We hope that we've taught them enough over time that they give the right answer. Let's see if I can get to the last little bit here in the 5 minutes or so that I have. So this next one, I'm going to just kind of
2021 at 8 p.m.
I'm just going to kind of blow through it a little bit because I want to get to the last text. So this is actually another very well-known text. Also comes from the Talmud, about a Jewish man, Simeon, son of Shetach, who buys a donkey. And around, if you remember this text, around the donkey's neck is a bag that contains a very precious jewel in it. And he buys the donkey from non-Jews. I'm summarizing the text here. And his students say, you can keep the jewel because they're not Jews and you're not obligated to return things to non-Jews. And I need to preface this by saying this was a rule in a particular time and age when Jews were persecuted by non-Jewish authorities. I don't think that most Jews practice this today in the ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist community. I think that they still do, but certainly not in Reform or progressive liberal Judaism and even modern Orthodoxy. His students say, you can keep the jewel. And he says, no, I bought a donkey, not the jewel. And if it becomes known that I took advantage of this person, that's not going to be good for the Jews. It's not going to be good for me. It's not going to look good on our people. Even if I can get away with it on a technicality, we have to be concerned about our character. How we go about things is an important factor. The flip of this is for a Jew to say, I'm not going to support anything that's not Jewish, is a reflection of our character. There may have been a time, but that is that we are not in this time anymore, where a Jew can say, I only give to Jewish causes. Would be my summary of this particular text. Do you think that Shimon Shetach is a barbarian? Shimon, son of Shetach, preferred hearing, blessed be the God of the Jews to all the riches of this world. He wanted people to go out there and say, look at this mensch of a Jew. He could have taken this stone, this precious jewel, and he didn't. So it's a PR play. So I'm going to leave that, just note the character is important. He's holding himself to a higher standard. And this raises another question, which is to what extent does society rely on some people holding themselves to a higher standard? On some people, not, if we think that the that the Singer approach is the higher standard, right? The universal approach is the higher, not normative standard of caring for family first. To what extent do we rely on some people in society holding themselves to a higher standard, sending off money to Africa? Because we know everybody's not going to do that. But if Africa is going to get anything, some people are going to have to hold themselves to that higher standard. And I think about it in terms of our tax system or access to universal health care, right? Not some people are going to game the system. They always are. So we rely on enough people not gaming the system and waiting in line and paying, you know, the exact amount, whatever it is, without even fear of being caught, so that it works. So there's that question, I think, which is that to what extent do we rely on this higher standard? It's like that old Hebrew National commercial, Jews answer to a higher authority. To what extent is our society based on this idea that some are going to exceed the ethical criteria so that it works? And here's our last text. So this is Rabbi Menachem Mary. He was a medieval French commentator who actually had a very warm relationship with his Christian neighbors. And I think his approach is transformative to this whole concept of how do we decide between the universal and the particular. The rabbis established the principle of do not wrong your fellow. This is in Leviticus that we didn't read, but we could have in last session, and applied it to one who is with you in Torah and commandments. All who are from the nations, this is the non-Jews, that are guided by the ways of religion and serve God in any way, even though their faith is far from ours, are exactly like Jews, regarding these matters, whether in lost articles or in business errors or in all other matters without distinction. So Rabbi Mary is saying there are no distinctions about religion. We are all created b'tselem Elohim, and therefore everybody is part of your family. You can't draw a line and say, I only care for Jews and not for non-Jews. That's not a line that you can draw. You can draw a line on relationship, proximity of children, parents, that kind of thing. But you can't say Jew and non-Jew, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. You can't draw those lines. The category that used to refer to Jews, your fellow in Torah mitzvot, should now apply to all civil people. As a result, in the previous source's story of the unnoticed precious stone, the students would have been required by Jewish law to return the lost stone to the person who sold the donkey. Thus, the category of covenant ethics can include more people and groups than previously thought. Alternatively, creation ethics require more affirmative ethical responsibilities than previously thought. Remember, we said that creation ethics was just don't kill people. And here we're saying now you have to, character matters, you have to go to a higher standard. So our final questions for this evening in the few minutes we have. What are the costs and benefits of Mary's innovation? What distinction do you yourself draw on religious grounds? And is his position the way that we live today? Are all treated equally? Feel free to answer any or none of those. What is your takeaway from tonight? I guess is really my question. How do you decide between these two? What's the right path? Anyone? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I mean, in the end, it's still, you don't take it with you, do you? So you've got to give it all up. Where are you going to give it up? It still comes back to a matter of conscience. And of course, there's no simple answers to any of these questions. Although when it comes to when you have no choice, it's either A or B. Of course, I'm a universalist because in the end, that's the only thing that ultimately applies for everyone, Jewish or not. It's not too complicated.
I think we're all individuals and we have a different response or reaction to these things. So there's no one blanket answer for all of us.
No, of course not. Of course not. I'm just looking for what your answer is. Sharon.
I think it's interesting that in our community, our Jewish Federation, I think, takes that view, like Rabbi Mary, because I'm sure you'll see by the end of the week when we read the Federation little blurb that comes out, that they are giving money from our Federation to help all the merit people and so on and so on. And I think it's something to be proud of, that we have that kind of federation.
Interesting. I was just having Ezra's coming here in a few minutes to teach with me in a moment, and he and I had our monthly meeting where we catch up, and I asked exactly that question. And Federation's trying to figure out what to do. Like, where is the need? And it's not a question of should we, it's a question of where, right? So the answer to your point is yes. Federation has said, even though there's not a whole lot of Jews in the interior, and we need to do something. Let me see if I can get Violetta and Shirley quickly, and then we got to wrap up because I got to go teach. Violetta.
Hi. I think that we have a moral responsibility to people in need in general. And even though you said that you like the word balancing, it makes me think of Musar, which is an old tradition of ethics. And in Musar, we use that principle of balancing. For example, the person that is too generous and the person is way too generous, it's not good for the person, it's not good for the people that the person helps. We have a moral responsibility to care for others. And I wanted to just, emphasize that not all that our responsibility is financial. Certainly we're talking about time. I'm talking about a cup of soup, a present, a coat, anything that we can give to another person to just make them feel loved and cared for. That's basically my position.
Thank you, Violetta. Shirley, really quickly, then I got to wrap up.
Okay, so I watched the Janusz Korczak presentation last night. He was a Jewish pediatrician who stayed with his charges until they all died, unfortunately. Anyway, the presentation on the basis of his values and beliefs was given to a young Bangladeshi student in the PhD program in education, and she received it. She was wearing her hijab, and I just was very moved by that. Basically a Jewish organization.
So connect the dots for me. How does that relate to this?
So the dots are that, we can look at maybe I can't connect the dots, but we can look at the broader community as Rabbi Mary did. And it doesn't have to be only Jews, and we're doing good things.
Mm-hmm. Right. So just to expand on that, and then to conclude, thank you, Shirley, that one has to do with how we draw those lines of particularistic. If we draw very narrow particularistic lines, perhaps we're failing in our ethical responsibilities, but we could still be particularistic if we broaden our circles of particularism. If we don't just keep it to the Jews or keep it to our family is how we define like a nuclear family. But the broader we can make those circles, we can begin to approach Green's idea or Singer's idea of a universalism while still being discerning in who we support. So the summary of tonight's class is this. Jewish ethics is built on a system of universalistic and particularistic obligations, which generally coexist. So this tension is good, and living with that tension is what it means to be a Jew. There is no absolute here. We have to be, it is a living process, and that's where Talmud and all these texts and this discussion come in. That's what we debate all the time, is how to do it right. In some situations, particularly those of finite resources, these two sets of obligations come into conflict. That's nothing surprising to us. And in such situations, some voices in the Jewish ethical tradition emphasize the universal, and some emphasize the particular, while other voices reject the framework entirely. Nothing new under the sun, right? Ein chadash tachat hashamayim, two Jews, many opinions. Our tradition doesn't have, as much as I would like it to, a clear answer that says you should be universalistic or particularistic. What it has is a whole bunch of arguments on all sides of that issue, but no clear Halakha means the way. There is no halakha on this. There are many halachot. There are many different paths to resolving this tension. The rest of our course will try to resolve those paths. Well, not try to resolve. The rest of our course will try to lay out those paths so that you can pick the one that you want to follow, or the ones you want to follow. Thank you all very much for tonight. I've got to go teach JIC. I'm late. Wonderful to see you all, and you'll have Rabbi Brown next week. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.